Eli Carter had always believed in hard work. His farm, passed down through 3 generations, had kept him alive despite the droughts, the poor soil, and the seasons of struggle. But this year, the land had turned against him. His corn was withering, his wheat was stunted, and the crows had grown bold, pecking away at what little remained. His old scarecrow, battered by years of sun and rain, stood useless in the middle of the field, its straw stuffing spilling from its burlap body. With a sigh, Eli decided it was time for something new. At the town's fall festival, he found the scarecrow at a peculiar little stall. The vendor, an old woman with a crooked smile, claimed it was special, hand-stitched from something ancient. Eli had laughed at her theatrics but bought it anyway. It was sturdier than his old one, with a face sewn into a twisted grin and deep, hollow eyes. That night, he set it up in the field. He drove the wooden post deep into the ground and secured its limbs with twine. When he was done, he stepped back and admired his work. The scarecrow looked almost alive in the moonlight, its grin wider than he remembered. The next morning, something miraculous had happened. The crops were greener, taller. The once withered stalks had regained life overnight, their golden heads bending under the weight of healthy grains. And not a single crow in sight. Eli was stunned. He stood in the field, running his fingers through the healthy stalks, marveling at the overnight transformation. The scarecrow loomed above him, its hollow eyes watching. At first, he thought it was luck. But as the days passed, the crops only grew stronger, thick and unnaturally vibrant. The livestock, too, seemed healthier. Then the shadows came. Late at night, Eli would wake to the rustling of the corn stalks, though there was no wind. The animals grew restless, staring toward the field with wide, unblinking eyes. More than once, he thought he saw movement out there, tall and thin, lurking between the stalks. One evening, as he was locking up the barn, he looked toward the scarecrow and froze. It had moved. It wasn't where he had placed it. It stood several feet closer to the house, its grinning face tilted toward him. The wooden post was still in the ground, but its feet were dragging through the dirt. A cold dread settled in Eli's stomach. He tried to reason with himself. Maybe he had been mistaken. Maybe the wind had shifted it. But the next morning, it had moved again. Closer still, and this time the footprints in the dirt were unmistakable. That night, Eli sat on his porch with a shotgun across his lap, waiting. Hours passed. The wind whispered through the corn, carrying the distant hoot of an owl. The scarecrow stood where it had been that morning. Then, at midnight, it took a step forward. Eli nearly dropped his gun. His heart pounded as the scarecrow's body twisted unnaturally, its grin stretching wider. A whisper brushed through the air. "Feed me." Eli scrambled to his feet, his pulse pounded in his ears. "What?" he croaked. "You want the land to thrive," the voice murmured, crawling into his skull. "You must give something in return." Eli backed away. No, this isn't real." But the scarecrow moved again, its arms lifting slightly, its body swaying as if breathing. "The crops live because I feed. The animals thrive because I drink." The realization hit Eli like a thunderclap. The unnatural growth, the lushness of the land, it wasn't a miracle. It was a trade, a bargain, and he had taken without paying. "What do you want?" he whispered. The scarecrow's hollow eyes bore into him. A life. Eli thought of his animals, his old hound, Duke, the cattle, the sheep. With shaking hands, he ran to the barn. He grabbed a struggling chicken, its claws scratching at his skin. He rushed to the field and threw it at the scarecrow's feet. The ground swallowed it whole. The next day, the farm flourished again. The wheat stood taller than ever. The livestock glowed with health. The scarecrow remained still, watching, but Eli knew it wouldn't be enough. The whispers grew louder each night. The scarecrow wanted more. A pig, a cow, the dog. Each time the sacrifice was absorbed into the earth, each time the land grew richer. Then, one night, the Scarecrow spoke again. Not enough. Eli woke in a cold sweat. He knew what it meant. It wanted more than animals. It wanted something human. His mind raced. He couldn't, he wouldn't. But if he refused, what would happen? Would the land rot? Would it take him instead? The next day, Eli drove into town. He visited the bar, watched the drifters, the lost souls looking for work. That's when he found him, James, a homeless man eager for a job and a warm meal. Eli's hands shook as he brought James back to the farm, as he led him toward the field, as he offered him a place to rest in the old shed. At midnight, the Scarecrow whispered, "Now." James never screamed. The earth swallowed him just like the animals. The next morning, the farm was paradise, but Eli could no longer look at the land without seeing the truth beneath the soil. He tried to live with it, tried to convince himself it was necessary, but the nightmares didn't stop. The whispers grew hungrier. Then one evening, he saw something move in the field. James, or what used to be James, a twisted figure, arms too long, head lolling unnaturally, standing just beyond the cornstalks. Watching, Eli ran to the Scarecrow. "I gave you what you wanted," he screamed. The Scarecrow grinned. "More." Eli backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The land would never stop needing. The Scarecrow would never be satisfied. And Eli knew one day he would be next. That night, before the whispers could start again, Eli doused the field in gasoline. He struck a match and watched the fire devour everything. The wheat, the corn, the cursed soil. The Scarecrow twisted in the flames, its grin never fading. The whispers howled in agony as the farm burned. The land withered. The deal was broken. And Eli, for the first time in months, finally slept without nightmares. The wind rolled across the open fields, carrying the scent of damp earth and rotting corn husks. The Riley family farm had seen better days, but for the last few years, something had felt wrong. Ethan Riley, now the reluctant inheritor of the land, knew it wasn't just the failing crops or the unpredictable weather. There was something deeper, something unnatural buried beneath the soil. Ethan had grown up on this land, but after his father's passing, he had considered selling it. The house was old, the barn creaked in the night, and the fields never seemed to yield as much as they should. But something always held him back. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something else. It started subtly. The livestock became restless, their eyes wide with a fear Ethan couldn't place. His dog, Buck, refused to go near the western fields, standing at the edge, his ears pinned back, growling at the wind. Then the corn began to rot from the inside out. Then the nightmares started. Ethan dreamed of the earth splitting open, of something writhing beneath, pressing against the surface like a trapped animal desperate to escape. He would wake up drenched in sweat, the echoes of whispers lingering in his ears. He told himself it was just stress, just the weight of running a failing farm. But deep down, he knew better. One night, as the wind howled through the trees, Ethan heard something outside, a rhythmic rustling like something moving through the corn. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, his breath visible in the cold autumn air. The fields swayed in the moonlight, but there was no wind. Then he saw it. A figure, tall and thin, moving between the rows. At first, he thought it was a scarecrow knocked loose by the wind, but then it turned its head. The face was wrong, stretched, hollow. Its eyes were pits of darkness, and its mouth hung open as if screaming, though no sound came out. Ethan fired. The shot rang out, but the figure did not fall. It merely flickered, like a shadow cast by a dying flame. Then, in an instant, it was gone. Ethan stood frozen, heart hammering in his chest. His mind raced. Had he imagined it? Was exhaustion playing tricks on him? The next morning he went to inspect the field. The place where the figure had stood was marked by dead earth, blackened, cracked soil where nothing would grow. The air was thick with decay. He dug into the dirt with his hands, desperate for an answer. And then he found it. A bone. Human. Ethan recoiled, dropping the fragment as though it burned him. He had to call the sheriff. This was beyond him now. Sheriff Lyle Carter had known Ethan's father. He arrived that afternoon, skeptical but willing to listen. When Ethan led him to the field, however, the sheriff's expression changed. He knelt, brushing away more soil, revealing more bones beneath. A skull, its eye sockets filled with dirt, stared back at them. "Jesus," Carter muttered. "Looks like you got yourself an old graveyard." Ethan shook his head. "No grave markers, no records. My family's owned this land for generations. I'd know if there was a cemetery." Carter stood, dusting his hands off. "Might be something older. We'll need an excavation team out here." Ethan felt sick. The dreams, the dead crops, the figure in the fields. That night, the whispers returned. They were closer now, clearer. They spoke in a language he did not understand, but he felt their meaning deep in his bones. "Leave." Ethan woke to Buck barking furiously at the door. He grabbed his rifle again and stepped outside. The field was alive with movement. Shadows slithered between the stalks, taking form, reaching, grasping. The figures were back, dozens of them, shifting and swaying like dead leaves caught in an unseen current. Their faces were distorted, stretched into agonized expressions. Ethan raised his gun, but a voice, low and ragged, spoke behind him. "You can't stop the harvest." He turned, and there stood his father, or what was left of him. His skin hung in loose gray folds. His eyes were milky, lifeless. But his voice was the same. "They buried them here long before us, boy." His father's voice cracked with something between sorrow and warning. "And they don't like being forgotten." Ethan stumbled back, his mind screaming that this wasn't real. "You're dead," his father nodded. "And soon, you will be too." The ground trembled, the air turned foul, and the figures surged forward. Ethan fired, but the bullets did nothing. Hands, cold, strong, grabbed him, pulling him into the field. The earth split open beneath him, a gaping maw of darkness. He screamed as he was dragged down, the last thing he saw being the farmhouse lights flickering out, one by one. The Riley farm still stands, abandoned now. The fields never grew again. Travelers speak of strange sounds in the wind, of figures moving in the ruins of the barn, and sometimes on cold autumn nights they hear the echoes of a man screaming, lost beneath the soil. The wind whispered through the skeletal remains of corn stalks, bending them into eerie shapes beneath the pale glow of the moon. Noah Evans gripped the worn steering wheel of his old pickup as he turned down the dirt road leading to the abandoned McAllister farm. No one had lived here in decades. The last owner, Henry McAllister, had disappeared one autumn night in 1978, leaving only a house filled with dust and a field that never seemed to die. The locals claimed the land was cursed. Noah, a skeptic and aspiring journalist, saw an opportunity for a gripping exposé. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the farmhouse, a two-story relic of time, its windows gaping like empty sockets. The barn stood in the distance, its roof caved in. Beyond that, the field stretched endlessly, an unnatural green despite the frosty October air. Noah killed the engine, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out. The night was thick with silence, the kind that made the skin on his neck prickle. He pulled out his phone and recorded a voice memo. October 21st. Arrived at the McAllister farm. No sign of movement. We'll investigate the house first. He pushed open the farmhouse door. It creaked, breaking the silence. Inside, dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight. Furniture remained untouched, as if the family had simply walked out one evening and never returned. A plate still sat on the dining table. Brittle remnants of food congealed on its surface. The air smelled wrong. Not just of rot and abandonment, but something else. Something sickly sweet. A creak came from upstairs. Noah's breath hitched. He swung his flashlight toward the staircase, but there was nothing. Just old wood settling. He forced a chuckle. "Come on, Noah. Just your nerves." But the unease gnawed at him as he ascended the stairs. The hallway stretched before him, lined with doors. He opened the first one, a bedroom. The bed was still made, the covers undisturbed for years. A child's doll sat in the corner, its glassy eyes reflecting his flashlight beam. Then the whispering began. Noah froze. It came from the field. He rushed to the window. The corn stalks rustled unnaturally, shifting though the wind had died. Shadows moved between them, dark shapes darting just out of reach of his light. A sudden knock came from the front door below. Noah's heart pounded. Bang! Another knock. Louder this time. He bolted downstairs, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. The door was still ajar, swaying slightly. He hesitated, then stepped onto the porch, sweeping his light across the yard. Nothing. Then something crunched behind him. He spun. The front door slammed shut, shaking the house. A low whisper coiled through the air, curling around him like fingers. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language he knew. It was ancient, guttural, crawling into his ears and making his vision swim. Then the cornfield erupted. The stalks parted violently as figures emerged. Twisted, emaciated things with hollow faces and gaping mouths, their bodies wrapped in remnants of old farming clothes. Their heads jerked unnaturally as they stepped forward, their whispering voices merging into a single droning chant. Noah's paralysis broke. He ran. He sprinted past his truck toward the barn. The rusted doors barely held together as he pushed through. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Tools hung on the walls, long forgotten. A ladder led to the loft above. He scrambled up, pulling himself into the shadows. The figures entered the barn below, their movements inhuman, jerky, like marionettes on tangled strings. Their whispering grew louder. Noah clamped a hand over his mouth, forcing himself to stay still. Then, silence. They were gone. Or so he thought. A breath, warm and fetid, ghosted against his ear. Noah whirled around. A face loomed inches from his own, pale, stretched, its mouth unhinged as if screaming soundlessly. Fingers like brittle twigs reached for him. He kicked out, sending the thing sprawling. It shrieked, a high, bone-chilling wail, and the figures below erupted into a frenzy. Noah had no time to think. He leapt from the loft, landing hard on the dirt floor. His ankle twisted, sending pain shooting up his leg. He gritted his teeth and forced himself to move. The whispering surged again, closing in on him. He grabbed a rusted pitchfork and swung wildly as he limped toward the exit. One of the figures lunged. He drove the prongs into its chest. It convulsed, but instead of blood, a thick black liquid oozed from the wound. The creature wailed, crumbling into dust. Noah didn't wait to see if it would get back up. He bolted, adrenaline fueling his escape. The truck was his only chance. The figures swarmed behind him, their movements frantic, desperate. The whispering turned into an ear-splitting howl. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. Hands clawed at the windows, leaving streaks of dark residue. The engine roared to life. He floored it. The creatures shrieked as the headlights cut through them, dissolving them into the night. The whispering died as the truck sped away, leaving the cursed farm behind. Noah didn't stop until he reached the highway, where he finally dared to look in the rearview mirror. The McAllister farm sat silent in the distance. The field, once restless, was still, but Noah knew it was waiting for the next visitor, and it would not let them escape so easily. If you would to hear more terrifying horror stories, then please subscribe if you dare.
Whoa!